Well, as a writer, mythology is everything. Despite what people might think, even fiction has a mythological element to it. We create mythologies. Mythologies are hardwired into us. And whether we know it or not, we are actually making the mythologies of the future. I think Joseph Campbell said that all stories have the same mythological elements in them, the hero's journey, and with all those motifs that you get in the ancient myths. It doesn't matter whether it's the Bible or Buffy the Vampire Slayer, they all have those mythological characters that turn up because they are created by the human mind. I think one of the big problems today is myth blindness. Too many people are not listening to stories. I have a friend who owns a comic book shop in Chatham, and he gets young kids coming in there and saying, "Do you have any video games?" And he says, "No, we sell comic books and graphic novels." And they say, "Oh, stories are boring." Now that is scary, because it was the first time, I think, in the entire history of the human race that we're starting to lose interest in stories. And stories are about us. Our minds tell us stories. I read an article, I think, in a medical magazine a few years ago, that the temporal lobe of the brain actually tells you a story of yourself from the moment you get up in the morning to when you go to bed, and probably, I should imagine, while you're asleep. So stories make us who we are, and the stories that we tell also tell us. So I think you can never really discount the importance of stories. One of the things these stories tell us, of course, is the development of the human person. Within our lives, we go on a journey from the minute we are born and we start developing an ego to the moment we die. And in that journey, we encounter all those things that make us a fully realised adult person. Joseph Campbell calls this the hero's journey, or the monomyth. It's the central myth that all cultures have. On that journey, we meet threshold guardians, the female principal, the shadow, the mentor, all of these parts of ourselves. So I think without stories, we cannot actually become fully realised human beings. Fiction, I think Stephen King said this, fiction is the lie that contains the truth. So in a sense, I would rather see a work of fiction than so-called reality. You know, there's this thing at the moment, reality television, and I use reality in inverted commas because what you see when you watch reality television are people acting up, acting like spoilt children. I'd rather see professional actors acting out a script that a really good writer has come up with, and I think I would learn more than watching a bunch of people who are acting like spoilt brats in front of a camera. I don't have a lot of time for reality television, as you could guess. I think there's more truth in one episode of Star Trek than there is in how many years of Big Brother. Also, I think soap operas don't really work. The ancient Greeks knew one thing. If you want to talk about something important, you have to set it elsewhere, out there, in the netherworlds, on Olympus, with gods and monsters and beings that are not totally human. That is the way that you tell important things. So I would say, again, one episode of any of the sci-fi fantasy series that are well written has more truth than 25 years of EastEnders. One of the mythological motifs that I find most fascinating is the trickster. The trickster is a character that turns up in just about every mythology in the world, and the purpose of the trickster is to point the way towards the shadow. By the shadow, I mean that part of ourselves that we are not comfortable with, and from the moment that we start developing an ego, we start dumping stuff into that shadow self, that shadow part of our being. And if we're not careful and we don't connect with it and absorb it back into ourselves in a productive way, that shadow can be disastrous for the human psyche. One of the problems with Christian mythology is we've created an all-good God and an all-bad devil. I don't actually think that was there in the very beginnings of both Jewish or the Christian message, but I think it's developed that way, and because of that, the shadow in that message, which if you like you want to call a shadow Lucifer or Satan, is not a very helpful trickster figure. Amongst Native Americans you get countless trickster figures, and the trickster's purpose is to show us all the things that we should not do. If you lived in a society where you hunted, for instance, and you went out on the hunt, if one of you was behaving stupidly, you could get everybody else killed. And the best way, as you know, to learn a lesson is to make a mistake. You know, if your mother tells you, don't touch that hot thing, and you touch it and you burn yourself, you never touch it again. It's a bit more serious if that is a life-threatening mistake you have to make. So in these ancient stories in old Europe, in Africa, in the ancient Americas, you had these figures whose job it was to make all the mistakes, do all the stupid things, the antisocial things that would cause problems to themselves and to other people. This is only one part of the trickster's being, if you like. The trickster's quite a complex character, not just somebody that does stupid things, but somebody that's also a creator, somebody that brings gifts, because the trickster is connected to the unconscious, and of course it's the unconscious that gives us the ideas that we have that make us creative. Modern mythology. Of course all mythology was modern. If you think about it, the stories that those ancient Greeks or ancient Egyptians or ancient peoples of the world came up with were stories that they were telling about themselves. They set them in the past, but they were wearing the modern dress of the times. They would have recognised the way that things happened in them. The stories that we come up with now are set in the future, which is interesting because I suppose we feel that there's so much history behind us, but they are still mythological stories that tell us things about ourselves. I think if there was a truly modern mythological motif, I think it would be the cyborg. The idea of somebody that was part machine and part human. Do you think that? I think that's true. Mm-hmm. The part machine, part human character is probably warning us about the excesses of technology. For an example, probably the Terminator films. I think the character that Arnie Schwarzenegger plays in the first Terminator film is a salient warning that not to lose your humanity to the machine. So in a sense, that mythology is quite new. But the artificial human is a very interesting character because all stories are about what is it to be human. That is the message. In ancient times you had unhuman characters like gods, fairies, monsters, nymphs, centaurs, minotaurs. These characters not being human were there to tell us what it is to be human. I think, it's a bit like the Pinocchio character in that famous children's book, the wooden doll who wants to be a real boy. A modern example of that, I suppose, would be the character of Data in Star Trek. I mean, Data is there. His main purpose is to tell us what it is to be a human being by not being human and wanting to be human. So it's a very important character. Another good modern example, I think, is probably Dexter, this TV series about a sociopath who is a serial killer, really, but has developed a code in which he will only kill people who deserve to be killed, criminals that have got away with murder themselves. Very dubious morality there. But the interesting thing about the TV series is this character of Dexter is always trying to fit in and trying to be human. So I think Dexter is a descendant of Data, but a darker version. And I think that character's a very good way of telling us about ourselves. If you want to know about, if you like, normal psychology, you have to show abnormal psychology in somebody. So I think these characters are modern mythological motifs. The idea that there are connecting points in mythologies from all over the world is a good one, because we're all human. All mythologies come out of the human brain, and all human beings are basically the same. We may have slightly different social bias on a particular thing. Morality, for instance, our moralities might be slightly different from each other, but we do all develop moralities. Whether we like the morality of another group, that's a different question. But because we all develop moralities, we all end up creating mythologies that will explain those moral questions. So, you know, all human brains are basically the same. That is why we can all learn each other's languages. Somebody once said, if we could speak to dolphins, for instance, and dolphins could talk back to us, would we understand their myths? Because their myths come from a totally different biology. Would we understand the myths of alien beings from other worlds if we ever met them? I don't know. But the fact is that all human beings can understand each other, even though we may not agree with the morality of our different nations. And because myths arise out of our biology, they will always have certain motifs that will crop up time and time again. Heroes, villains, evil sorcerers, wise old men or women, the female principal as shown as the goddess. All of these characters will turn up constantly, time and time again. Well, in my own life, I think the trickster seems to crop up time and time again. You know, for me, I suppose the ancient European trickster figure is the fox. In French, renard is the fox, but you know, the old French word for fox was totally different. It's interesting that a group of medieval poems that had this character of renard in it was so popular that the French adopted that name for the animal, the fox. And so the fox has always kind of turned up in my dreams and in my poetry as well. And in my garden, for the last 10 years, I've had a fox living at the top of the garden. Perhaps not always the same fox, because the vixen had cubs a couple of years ago, and I seem to end up with younger foxes turning up. But quite often comes right up to the house, and I have a statue at the end of the garden that was made for me by Philip Absalon, the Stuckist artist. And Philip has made this life-size statue of a fox in a sitting position, which is at the end of the garden. And quite often the real fox will come and sit next to it or sit under it and go to sleep curled up under the statue. I've even got some photographs I've taken of that. So it's almost like every so often he's there to remind me of the wildness that's out there. And it's even entered dreams, which is interesting. Not just my dreams, but my wife even dreamed of this fox once at a time when I was full of doubt and thinking I should give up writing. My wife had this dream about hanging the washing up in the garden, and suddenly there's seeing the fox curled up at her feet by the hedge, and the fox just looked up and said, "Tell your husband he's got to keep on writing or we will be really angry with him." And she said, "Okay, I'll do that." Quite matter of fact, talking fox, didn't think anything of it. As you do in dreams. Dreams have their own logic. The strange thing is that a couple of months later, my neighbour was clearing up his garden, and in that exact same spot on the other side of the hedge, he found a skeleton of a fox that had died there in a curled up position. Strange. Yes, I prefer the word unexplainable to supernatural. I don't like the word supernatural because it says it's higher than nature. And although I don't believe in the supernatural, I do believe that the natural world is strange. And my life has been full of coincidences. And I think it's natural that there are coincidences in your life. So let's get rid of that word supernatural completely, but admit that the natural world is so strange that we don't fully understand it.
So is mythology a way into that? Or?
Mythology is a way into that strangeness in the world. People say to me, "Oh, I don't read fiction because there's too many coincidences in it," or "I don't like Shakespeare because there are too many coincidences in it." But my own life has certainly been full of coincidences and strange happenings. So I think that probably Shakespeare and fiction and Gabriel Garcia Marquez's magical realism is probably a closer version of reality than the mundane reality that people, I think, force themselves to believe in. I don't know.
Cool. Yeah, great interest in mythology. So how does that relate to your work? Do you work with mythology? Is your poetry basically based on that, or how has it informed your work?
Let me think about that. Because, when mythological motifs crop up in your work, they do so unconsciously. So you'd have to be a better judge of that than me. If you look at my paintings and you read my stories or poems, do you see mythology in them? People seem to.
But somebody who has a great vested interest in it, hasn't that got to come out a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, we've said in the past that things turn up in my paintings sometimes, and I don't know why they're there. Animals and birds and fish and mysterious-looking men and women who seem to be almost supernatural. So I suppose those mythological motifs are there. I can't say they're not. I don't consciously put them in. But then, as I've said before, that's how it works. One of the sad things is that Joseph Campbell discovered that the hero's journey, or the monomyth, was a kind of template that was underneath all stories. And when George Lucas made those Star Wars films, he consciously put all of those motifs in those films, and that is why they were so successful, I think. Now people are consciously trying to put those motifs in, and I think that's a mistake, because what Joseph was saying is that they crop up naturally. So, if you're writing a good story, if you're making a good film, if you're painting a good painting, those things turn up in it, whether you want them to or not. I suppose there's a work of literature that has a mythological feel to it. I would say 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I mean, that is a book that has everything. It has history, a love story, a political section, travel, poetry. It's a book that has everything in it. And it certainly develops its own mythology. The story of the village that's cut off from the rest of the world in this solitude. It's not just the solitude of that village, it's the solitude of Latin America being cut from European and North American culture and literature, but still there on the fringes of things, saying, yeah, we're here, this life is happening here as well. And you have these wonderful characters in it, like the character of Remedios, who's this sort of child bride, this innocent girl who blows away one day while she's hanging out the washing. And I think that's quite interesting, because if you live in a village, and I grew up in a small village in Kent, these are the kind of stories that, these are the kind of explanations that people might have come up with. Did she really blow away? No, probably not. But somebody might have said that one day, and then it went into the local mythology. You have the character of, is it Babylonia, the mechanic, who has clouds of yellow butterflies that follow him everywhere. It's a wonderful book. I mean, I'd say everyone should read it. And some people have problems with its fantastic hyperbole and exaggerations, but I think they're probably closer to reality than people think. There's a wonderful bit in it where a woman who has prophetic dreams, I can't remember her name now, which is bad because I read the book so many times, but this woman dreams about the coming of the railroad, and somebody says to her, what is it like? And she said, it was like an angry kitchen pulling a village behind it. Now, isn't that a wonderful description of a train? So I think anyone who's lived in a small community knows that you get these mythologies that grow up in small communities. Somebody disappears and everyone's got their version of why they disappear. Somebody has an affair and everybody knows they've had an affair, or they have an illegitimate child and everyone says, oh, do you notice that little child looks a bit like this person or that person? So you get these mythologies that grow up. Whether they're true or not, I don't know, but this is what happens. So I think if one reads 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez and reflects on this is the version that these people tell of themselves, I think it's a very truthful book.